This story follows a mother forced to live in a small, neglected room in her own yard after her son and daughter-in-law take over the main house. As she faces humiliation, loneliness, and the slow erosion of her dignity, she must decide whether to accept her fate or fight for her self-worth. Through heartbreak, confrontation, and a powerful turning point, this story reveals how one woman's courage to reclaim her place changes not only her life, but the entire family's future. In a world where respect is often taken for granted, this is a story about boundaries, resilience, and the moment she finally says enough. I never imagined my world would shrink to 4 cracked walls and a single window. Once, this house was my pride, a place I built with my own hands, brick by brick, memory by memory. I remember the laughter that used to echo through its halls, the smell of fresh roti in the mornings, the warmth of my son's small hand in mine as we planted the first rose bush in the yard. Back then, every corner of this home was filled with hope and the promise of a future I thought I could shape. But now I live in a tiny room at the edge of the yard, a space that feels more like a storage shed than a home. My world has become smaller, colder, and lonelier than I ever thought possible. The room is barely big enough for a bed and a small table. The paint peels from the walls, and the window rattles in the wind. At night, I hear the laughter and voices from the main house, my son, his wife, their friends, while I sit alone, listening to the creak of the old ceiling fan and the distant barking of stray dogs. Sometimes I press my ear to the thin door, hopping to catch a familiar word or a sign that I am still remembered. But most nights, there is only silence, broken by the occasional sound of my son's laughter, sharp, dismissive, as if my presence is nothing more than an inconvenience. I try to keep my dignity, to remind myself that I am still the woman who raised a family, who survived loss and hardship, who once filled this house with love. But it's hard not to feel exiled, cast out from the very life I created. The yard that was once my sanctuary is now a boundary, a line I am not meant to cross. My son's words echo in my mind. "You'll just have to accept it." He said it with a shrug, a half-smile, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for a mother to be pushed aside. Every morning, I sweep the little room, make my bed, and try to find purpose in small routines. I water the plants, mend old clothes, and watch the sun move across the cracked floor. I tell myself that I am strong, that I have survived worse, but the truth is, I feel invisible. I wonder if this is what the end of a life looks like, not a dramatic fall, but a slow fading into the background, a gradual erasure by those you love most. And yet, even in this tiny room, I hold on to a sliver of hope. Because sometimes, the smallest spaces can hold the biggest dreams, and the greatest strength is found in the places where you are most alone. I built this house with my own hands. How did I end up outside its walls? The question haunts me every morning as I wake in my tiny room, the same room that once stored my son's old toys and my husband's tools. I remember the day we first moved here, a young couple with nothing but hope and a few borrowed rupees. The house was little more than a shell, 4 bare walls and a leaky roof, but to me, it was a palace. My husband and I worked side by side, mixing cement, painting doors, and planting the first saplings in the yard. We dreamed of filling these rooms with laughter, of building a life that would shelter us from the storms outside. But life, as it always does, had other plans. My husband fell ill when our son was just a boy. The doctors said it was a matter of months, but he fought for years, refusing to leave us until he was sure we would be okay. I became both mother and father, learning to fix leaky pipes and balance the household accounts, all while holding my son's hand through every fever and every heartbreak. I worked as a seamstress, taking in clothes from the neighbors, and sometimes as a cook for the families in the big houses across town. Every rupee I earned went into this home, new windows, a better stove, a sturdy lock for the front door. I wanted my son to feel safe, to know that no matter what happened, he would always have a place to call his own. Raising him alone was never easy. There were days when I went hungry so he could eat, nights when I stayed up sewing by candlelight to pay for his school books. I taught him to be kind, to respect others, to work hard, and never take anything for granted. I told him stories of my own childhood, of the sacrifices my parents made, hoping he would understand the value of family and the meaning of home. I watched him grow from a shy, gentle boy into a confident young man, and every milestone, his first day at school, his first job, his wedding, felt like a victory for both of us. When he brought his bride home, I welcomed her with open arms. I remembered my own nervousness as a new daughter-in-law and wanted her to feel safe, wanted, and loved. I cooked her favorite dishes, included her in family traditions, and tried to give her the space to make this house her own. In those early days, there was laughter at the dinner table, shared secrets in the kitchen, and the gentle hope that our family would only grow stronger with her presence. I watched my son look at her with the same tenderness I once saw in his father's eyes, and I felt a quiet pride that our home could be a place of new beginnings. But as the months passed, small things began to change. My son became distant, his conversations shorter, his laughter less frequent. My daughter-in-law started making decisions without me: what to cook, who to invite, how to arrange the furniture. I told myself it was natural, that every family must adjust, that I should be grateful for their happiness. Yet, a subtle tension crept in, like a draft under a closed door. There were moments when I felt invisible, my opinions brushed aside, my presence tolerated rather than cherished. I tried to ignore the sting of being left out of plans, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the way my son's eyes darted away when I asked if everything was all right. Still, I held on to hope. I reminded myself of all the good times, all the love we had shared, all the sacrifices I had made. I believed that if I just tried harder, if I was more patient, more understanding, things would return to the way they were. I clung to the memories of my son as a little boy, to the promise I made to my husband to keep the family together, to the belief that love could overcome any obstacle. But love, I learned, is not always enough. Sometimes the more you give, the more you are taken for granted. Sometimes hope turns into disappointment, and sacrifice becomes a silent burden. I watched as the home I built with so much care slowly slipped away from me, not with a single act of cruelty, but with 1,000 small cuts, each one a reminder that the family I fought so hard to protect was changing in ways I could no longer control. And so, as I stood outside my own locked door, I wondered, after all these years, after all this love, how did it come to this? It started with whispers and ended with a locked door. In the beginning, the changes were so small I almost missed them. My daughter-in-law, Aisha, arrived with a suitcase full of dreams and a heart full of hope. I welcomed her as my own, eager to share the warmth of our home and the lessons I'd learned over a lifetime. For a while, everything felt new and promising. We cooked together, laughed over silly mistakes, and shared stories late into the night. I thought, perhaps, that the family I'd worked so hard to build was finally complete. But as the weeks passed, I noticed a subtle shift. Isha began to rearrange the kitchen, moving my favorite pots and spices to new places. She started making decisions about meals and guests without asking, and my son, who once checked with me about everything, now deferred to her. At first, I told myself it was natural. Every new bride wants to make her mark, to feel at home. I tried to step back, to give them space, but each small change felt like a piece of my world quietly slipping away. The real pain began with the little slights. Aisha would sigh when I offered advice, or roll her eyes if I suggested a different way to do things. She started correcting me in front of guests, making small jokes at my expense. My son, caught between us, would laugh nervously or change the subject. I tried to laugh along, not wanting to cause a scene, but inside, each comment stung. I began to feel like a guest in my own home, tiptoeing around, afraid to upset the delicate balance. Family gatherings became more strained. My son and Aisha would sit close together, their heads bent in private conversation. When I tried to join in, they would fall silent or exchange glances I wasn't meant to see. I started spending more time in my room, telling myself I was just giving them privacy, but the truth was, I felt unwelcome. The house that once echoed with warmth now felt cold and unfamiliar. Even the routines that once brought me comfort began to change. My favorite chair in the living room was suddenly moved to a corner, replaced by a new, modern sofa. The old family photos I cherished were taken down and replaced with abstract art. The kitchen, once my domain, became a place where I felt like an intruder. I found myself asking permission to use my own stove, to cook my own recipes. The hardest part was watching my son change. He became quieter, more withdrawn, as if he was caught between two worlds and didn't know where he belonged. I saw the conflict in his eyes, the guilt he tried to hide. I wanted to reach out, to remind him of the bond we once shared, but every attempt was met with resistance. Aisha's influence was growing, and I was slowly being pushed to the margins. I tried to hold on to the idea of family unity, to believe that this was just a phase, that things would get better. But the quiet division in the house grew deeper with each passing day. The love and laughter that once filled our home were replaced by silence and suspicion. I realized that sometimes the most painful betrayals are not loud or violent. They are the slow, silent ones that make you question your place in the world. And as the tension in the house became impossible to ignore, I knew that something fundamental had changed, and there was no going back. Every night, I wondered if I was invisible or just inconvenient. The tiny room in the yard became my world, not by choice, but by slow, relentless exile. It was never a single argument or a dramatic confrontation that pushed me out. It was the accumulation of small humiliations, the daily reminders that I was no longer welcome in the home I had built. At first, it was just a suggestion. Isha needed more space for her things. The house was getting crowded. Wouldn't I be more comfortable in the quiet of the yard? My son, eyes averted, mumbled something about privacy and modern families. I agreed, not wanting to cause trouble, telling myself it was temporary. But temporary became permanent, and soon my life was reduced to a cramped room with a single window and a door that creaked in the wind. The indignities were endless. I had no bathroom of my own, so I waited until the house was empty to slip inside and use the facilities, always careful to clean up and leave no trace. My meals were often eaten alone, on a stool by the window, listening to the clatter of dishes and laughter from the main house. Sometimes, Isha would bring me a plate, her face tight with forced politeness, but more often I cooked for myself, reheating leftovers or making do with bread and tea. The kitchen, once my kingdom, was now off limits unless I asked permission. Even the garden, which I had tended for years, became a place I visited only when no one was watching. Privacy was a memory. The yard was open to the street, and neighbors could see me coming and going, carrying laundry or groceries, always alone. I felt their eyes on me, their curiosity and pity. Some would stop to chat, offering sympathy or gossip, but most just watched, shaking their heads at the old woman who had been pushed out by her own family. I tried to hold my head high, to pretend I didn't care, but every whispered comment, every sideways glance, chipped away at my dignity. Inside the room, I surrounded myself with reminders of better days. A faded photograph of my wedding, a small vase of artificial flowers, the quilt I had sewn for my son when he was a child. These things were my armor against the shame and loneliness that threatened to overwhelm me. I kept busy with small tasks, mending clothes, reading old letters, tending a few potted plants on the windowsill. But the silence was heavy, broken only by the distant sounds of life from the house I once called my own. The pain of being treated as an outsider was sharper than any physical discomfort. I was no longer consulted about family decisions, no longer invited to celebrations or even simple meals. My opinions were dismissed, my presence barely acknowledged. When relatives visited, I was introduced as Amy, she likes her privacy, as if I had chosen this isolation. I smiled and nodded, swallowing my pride, but inside I was screaming. I wanted to ask my son, "Do you remember who raised you? Who stayed up with you when you were sick? Who sacrificed so you could have a better life?" But the words caught in my throat, choked by years of silence and disappointment. Nights were the hardest. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house, doors opening and closing, laughter drifting through open windows, the television playing late into the night. Sometimes I heard my son's voice, and for a moment I would imagine him as a little boy, running to me for comfort. But those days were gone, replaced by a cold distance I could not bridge. I wondered if he ever thought of me, if he ever felt a pang of guilt or regret. Or was I simply a problem solved, an inconvenience moved out of sight? There were moments when I questioned my own worth. Was I too demanding, too old-fashioned, too much of a burden? Had I failed as a mother, as a person? The shame was suffocating, a constant reminder that I no longer belonged. I tried to remind myself of my strength, of the years I had survived on my own, but the isolation wore me down. I missed the simple joys of family life, a shared meal, a kind word, the feeling of being needed. Yet, even in the depths of humiliation, I refused to let go of hope. I told myself that I was more than my circumstances, that dignity could not be taken away by a locked door or a cold meal. I began to dream of a different life, one where I was valued for who I was, not just what I could provide. I started to imagine what it would feel like to reclaim my place in the world, to stand up and say, I deserve better. Every night, as I lay in my tiny room, I promised myself that I would not let this be the end of my story. Because sometimes, the greatest strength is found in the places where you are most alone, and the first step to reclaiming your life is refusing to accept less than you deserve. The day he laughed was the day I stopped waiting for kindness. It was a small moment, almost ordinary in its cruelty, but it changed everything. I had spent weeks trying to adjust to my new life in the yard, telling myself that things would get better, that my son and his wife would eventually remember the woman who raised them. I tried to be helpful, to stay out of the way, to keep the peace. But the peace was a lie, and the silence in my heart was growing heavier with every passing day. That afternoon, the sky was heavy with rain. I had just finished hanging the laundry on the line when a sudden downpour soaked everything. I rushed to gather the clothes, slipping in the mud, my hands shaking as I tried to save what I could. My sari was drenched, my hair plastered to my face, and I felt every year of my age in my aching bones. As I struggled with the last bedsheet, I heard laughter from the veranda. My son and Aisha stood in the doorway, watching me. He nudged her and said, loud enough for me to hear, she'll just have to accept it. This is her life now. The words hit me harder than the rain. I looked up, hoping for a sign of sympathy, but found only amusement in his eyes. Isha turned away, pretending not to notice. My son's laughter echoed in the yard, sharp and dismissive, as if my struggle was nothing more than a joke. In that moment, something inside me broke. The pain of humiliation was replaced by a surge of anger, a fierce determination that I had not felt in years. I went back to my tiny room, my clothes clinging to my skin, and sat on the edge of the bed. Tears streamed down my face, but they were not just tears of sadness. They were tears of awakening. I realized that I had spent too long waiting for kindness, too long hoping that love would be enough to change hearts that had already turned cold. I thought of all the sacrifices I had made, all the nights I had gone without so my son could have more, all the dreams I had set aside for his happiness. And now, I was nothing more than a burden, a source of amusement, a problem to be managed. The despair was overwhelming, but beneath it, a new strength began to grow. I remembered the woman I used to be, the one who built this house, who survived loss and hardship, who never gave up no matter how hard life became. I realized that I still had that strength within me, buried under years of silence and disappointment. I wiped my tears and looked around the small room, seeing it not as a prison, but as a starting point. If my son could laugh at my pain, then I would find a way to laugh again, too, but on my own terms. That night, I made a decision. I would no longer accept this life of exile and humiliation. I would no longer wait for someone else to give me permission to be happy. I began to make plans, small at first, reaching out to old friends, gathering the documents that proved my ownership of the house, researching my rights as a mother and a homeowner. I started keeping a journal, writing down every slight, every insult, every moment of strength. The act of writing was healing, a way to reclaim my voice and remind myself that my story was not over. The next morning, I greeted my son and Aisha with a calm they did not expect. I smiled, not out of submission, but out of resolve. I began to assert myself in small ways, joining them at the dinner table without asking, speaking up when decisions were made, refusing to be invisible. At first, they were surprised, even annoyed, but I did not back down. I had spent too long living in fear of their disapproval. Now I was living for myself. The laughter that once wounded me became a catalyst for change. I realized that strength is not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain define you. I found hope in the smallest victories, a kind word from a neighbor, a moment of peace in my garden, the knowledge that I was still capable of joy. I began to dream again, not of the life I had lost, but of the life I could still build. The day my son laughed at me was the day I stopped waiting for kindness and started demanding respect. It was the day I remembered who I was and who I could still become. And as I took the first steps toward reclaiming my dignity, I knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be mine. One piece of paper changed everything. For months, I had lived in the shadow of my own home, feeling powerless and invisible, my world reduced to a tiny room in the yard. I had accepted my fate with a heavy heart, believing that my son and daughter-in-law held all the power, that my place in the family was whatever they decided it should be. But life, in its quiet way, sometimes offers a second chance, a moment when the truth, long hidden, finally comes to light. It happened on a day like any other, when the sky was heavy with clouds and the air was thick with the promise of rain. I was searching through an old trunk for a warm shawl when my fingers brushed against a sealed envelope tucked beneath a pile of faded letters. Curious, I opened it and found a stack of legal documents, deeds, receipts, and at the very bottom a will written in my late husband's careful handwriting. My heart pounded as I read the words. The house, in its entirety, was left to me. Not to my son, not to his wife, but to me, with clear instructions that I alone had the right to decide its future. For a long moment, I sat in stunned silence, the weight of the truth settling over me. All this time, I had believed I was powerless, that my place in the family depended on the whims of those who now treated me as an outsider. But here, in black and white, was proof that I was still the rightful owner of the home I had built. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. I had leverage, a way to reclaim my dignity, but I also had a choice to make. Would I use this power to seek revenge, or to restore balance and respect in my fractured family? As I turned the pages, I found more than just legal jargon. My husband had written a letter to me, tucked between the documents. In it, he reminded me of the strength I had shown through every hardship, the love I had given without measure, and the promise we had made to protect our family, no matter what. His words were a balm to my wounded heart, a reminder that I was not alone, that my sacrifices had not gone unnoticed. Armed with this new knowledge, I began to see my situation differently. The tiny room in the yard was no longer a symbol of my defeat, but a temporary exile, one I could end on my own terms. I started to gather information, speaking quietly with a trusted neighbor who had once worked as a legal clerk. She confirmed what I already suspected. My son and daughter-in-law had no legal right to evict me or claim the house as their own. If I chose, I could assert my ownership and demand the respect I deserved. The powerlessness that had defined my days began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of empowerment. I no longer felt like a victim, waiting for scraps of kindness. Instead, I felt a quiet confidence, a sense that I could shape my own destiny. I started to plan my next steps carefully, knowing that the truth was my greatest weapon. I decided to confront my son and daughter-in-law, but this time I would do so from a place of strength, not desperation. I made copies of the documents and the will and arranged a meeting in the main house. When the day came, I walked in with my head held high, the envelope clutched firmly in my hand. My son looked surprised to see me, and Aisha's eyes narrowed with suspicion. I sat at the table and laid out the papers, my voice steady as I explained what I had found. "This house is mine," I said, meeting their eyes. "It always has been. I have the right to decide who lives here and under what conditions. I am not asking for charity or pity. I am demanding the respect that is owed to me." The room was silent, the tension thick. My son tried to protest, but I held up a hand. "I am not here to argue. I am here to set things right. You can choose to live here as a family with respect and kindness, or you can find another place to call home. The choice is yours, but the decision is mine." For the first time in months, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. The power dynamic had shifted, and they knew it. I was no longer the powerless mother in the yard. I was the rightful owner of my life and my home. The secret I had discovered was not just a legal technicality. It was a lifeline, a chance to reclaim my dignity and rewrite the rules of my own story. "If you lock me out, I'll open my own door." That thought echoed in my mind as I prepared for the conversation that would change everything. For months, I had lived in the shadow of my own home, silenced by shame and fear, but now I held the truth in my hands, a truth that gave me the strength to speak. I was no longer the invisible mother in the yard. I was the woman who built this family, and I was ready to reclaim my place. I called my son and daughter-in-law into the main room, the same space where we had once celebrated birthdays and shared laughter. The air was thick with tension. My son looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot, while Aisha crossed her arms, her face set in a mask of defiance. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years settle on my shoulders, and began. I have something to say, and I want you both to listen. My voice was steady, stronger than I expected. For too long, I have accepted things I never should have. I let myself be pushed aside, made small, and treated as if I didn't matter. But that ends today. Yisha rolled her eyes, but I didn't let it shake me. I placed the legal documents on the table, the will and the deed that proved my ownership of the house. This home is mine. I built it, I paid for it, and I have the right to decide who lives here and how we live together. I am not asking for your permission. I am telling you the truth. My son's face turned pale. He tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand. No, you need to hear this. I have loved you both, and I wanted nothing more than for us to be a family. But love does not mean allowing myself to be disrespected. I will not live in the yard like a stranger. I will not be silent while you make decisions about my life without me. The room was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. I could see the shock in their eyes, the realization that the balance of power had shifted. For the first time, I felt in control, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. I am setting new boundaries, I continued. If you want to live here, you will treat me with dignity. We will share this home as equals, with open communication and mutual respect. If that is not possible, you are free to find another place to live. But I will not be locked out of my own life any longer. Aisha's voice trembled as she spoke. You're overreacting. We just wanted some space. I shook my head. Space is not the same as exile. Privacy is not the same as isolation. You could have talked to me, but instead you chose silence and secrets. That is not how families work. My son finally found his voice. Amy, I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much this was hurting you. I looked at him, my heart aching with both love and disappointment. It's not too late to change, but it starts with honesty. I need to know that I matter. That my years of sacrifice and love mean something. I need to know that I am not just a burden to be managed, but a person to be respected. The confrontation was tense, emotions raw and close to the surface. But as we spoke, something shifted. The walls built by months of silence and resentment began to crumble. My son reached for my hand, his eyes filled with regret. I want us to be a family again, Amy. I want to make things right. Yisha nodded, tears in her eyes. I'm sorry. I let my own insecurities get in the way. I never meant to hurt you. I squeezed their hands, feeling a wave of relief and hope. We can start over, but only if we are honest with each other. Only if we respect each other's boundaries and needs. I am willing to forgive, but I will not forget. The rules have changed, and I will not go back to the way things were. As the conversation ended, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I had found my voice, reclaimed my place, and set the terms for my own happiness. The journey was not over, and there would still be challenges ahead, but I knew that I had taken the first step toward healing. If you lock me out, I'll open my own door. And in doing so, I discovered that the key to my freedom was in my hands all along. Sometimes, you have to lose everything to find yourself. In the days after I reclaimed my place in the house, the air was thick with uncertainty. My son and daughter-in-law moved through the rooms with a new caution, their voices softer, their steps more careful. The old routines were gone, replaced by an uneasy quiet as we all tried to adjust to the new reality. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of my own choices and the freedom that came with them. At first, the change was awkward. My son avoided my gaze, unsure how to bridge the distance that had grown between us. Aisha, once so confident, now seemed hesitant, as if she was waiting for me to lash out or seek revenge. But I had no interest in punishment. I wanted peace, not power. I wanted to rebuild what could be saved and let go of what could not. I began by reclaiming small pieces of my life, cooking my favorite meals, tending the garden, and inviting old friends for tea. I filled the house with laughter and warmth, not out of spite, but out of a desire to heal. Some relationships were beyond repair. A few relatives, uncomfortable with the new balance, drifted away. Old friends who had only ever seen me as a caretaker struggled to understand my newfound independence. I let them go, grateful for the memories, but unwilling to return to a life of silent sacrifice. In their place, I found new connections, women at the community center, neighbors who admired my courage, and even strangers who reached out after hearing my story. Together, we formed a small community of survivors, each of us learning to value ourselves in a world that often asks women to give until there is nothing left. With time, I discovered a sense of peace I had never known before. I no longer measured my worth by how much I could endure or how many problems I could solve for others. Instead, I learned to celebrate my own victories, no matter how small. A day spent reading in the sun, a meal cooked just for myself, a walk through the market where I bought flowers simply because they made me happy. I found joy in solitude, in the freedom to make my own choices, and in the knowledge that I had survived the worst and come out stronger. My home became a place of renewal rather than regret. I redecorated the living room, choosing colors and fabrics that reflected my own taste. I hung new curtains, planted a small garden, and filled the shelves with books I had always wanted to read. The house was still shared, but it was no longer a battleground. It was a space where I could breathe, dream, and grow. The greatest change, however, was within myself. I no longer feared being alone because I had learned to enjoy my own company. I no longer waited for others to validate my existence because I knew my own value. I forgave my son and daughter-in-law, not because they had earned it, but because I refused to let bitterness define my future. Forgiveness, I realized, was not a gift to them, but a gift to myself, a way to let go of the past and embrace the possibilities of tomorrow. As the seasons changed, so did I. I started volunteering at the local community center, helping other women find their voices and stand up for their rights. I shared my story, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testament to resilience and hope. I encouraged others to set boundaries, to demand respect, and to believe in their own strength. The more I gave, the more I received, a sense of purpose, a network of support, and the satisfaction of knowing that my pain had not been in vain. Looking back, I see that losing everything was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. I found myself in the ashes of my old life, and from those ashes I built something stronger, more beautiful, and entirely my own. The journey was hard and the scars remain, but they are a reminder of how far I have come. I am no longer defined by what I have lost, but by what I have gained: peace, independence, and a renewed sense of self-worth. And as I move forward, I do so with the knowledge that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to start again. Your worth is not defined by where you sleep, but by how you rise. As I look back on the journey that led me from the heart of my home to a tiny room in the yard and finally back to myself, I see not just the pain and regret, but the wisdom and healing that grew from those wounds. For years, I believed that being a good mother meant giving everything: my time, my energy, my dreams, without ever asking for anything in return. I thought that love was measured by sacrifice, that silence was a sign of strength, and that my value depended on how much I could endure for the sake of my family. But life, in its harshest moments, taught me a different lesson: that boundaries are not walls, but bridges to healthier relationships, and that self-respect is the foundation of every true connection. Regret is a heavy burden, and for a long time I carried it everywhere. I regretted not speaking up sooner, not insisting on my place in the family, not teaching my son that kindness and respect are not optional. I regretted every moment I let myself be pushed aside, every time I swallowed my hurt to keep the peace. But pain, I have discovered, is also a teacher. It forced me to confront the truth about my relationships, to see clearly where love had turned into obligation, and where giving had become enabling. I learned that it is not selfish to set boundaries, to say no, to demand respect. In fact, it is the only way to ensure that love remains a gift, not a burden. Healing began the day I chose to value myself. It was not easy. There were days when the loneliness felt unbearable, when the memories of laughter and togetherness haunted me like ghosts. But slowly, I learned to forgive, not just my family, but myself. I forgave myself for believing that my worth depended on others, for staying silent when I should have spoken, for loving so much that I forgot to love myself. Forgiveness was the key that unlocked the door to my own freedom. The most important lesson I learned is that boundaries are not about shutting people out, but about inviting the right people in. By setting limits, I taught my family how to treat me, and I taught myself that I deserved better. Respect is not about fear or control. It is about honesty, empathy, and mutual understanding. When I finally spoke up, I discovered a strength I never knew I had, and I found that others respected me more, not less, for standing my ground. To every mother listening who feels invisible, unappreciated, or afraid to speak her truth, I want you to know you are not alone. Your voice matters. Your feelings are valid. It is never too late to change the rules, to demand respect, and to reclaim your place in the world. The journey may be hard, and the cost may be high, but the reward is a life lived with dignity and self-worth. As I close this chapter, I do so with hope. Hope that my story will inspire others to find their own strength, to set their own boundaries, and to believe in their own value. Pain may be inevitable, but healing is possible. Regret may linger, but wisdom endures. And in the end, your worth is not defined by where you sleep, but by how you rise. Your story matters, share it, and let's heal together. As I close this chapter of my journey, I want to reach out to every woman, every mother, every person who has ever felt alone in their pain. Maybe you've been through something similar. Maybe you've felt invisible in your own home, or struggled to find your voice in a world that too often asks women to stay silent. Maybe you've faced betrayal, loneliness, or the heartbreak of being pushed aside by those you love most. Or maybe you're just searching for a place where your experiences are understood and your feelings are honored. Auntie's living room is more than just a channel. It's a community built on empathy, courage, and the belief that every voice deserves to be heard. Here, we don't judge or shame. We listen, we support, and we learn from one another. I invite you to share your own journey in the comments below. Tell us about the moment you found your strength, the lesson you learned, or the boundary you set that changed your life. Your words might be the encouragement someone else needs to take their first step toward healing. If my story resonated with you, please subscribe to Auntie's Living Room for more real-life stories, lessons, and conversations that matter. Like this video if you believe in the power of honesty and self-respect. Share it with a friend or family member who might need a reminder that they are not alone. And most importantly, keep the conversation going. Because every time we speak up, we make it easier for others to do the same. Together, we can create a space where silence is replaced by sharing, where isolation gives way to community, and where every woman, every mother, every daughter, and every friend knows that her story is valued. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being part of this journey. Remember, your story matters. Share it and let's heal together. Let's build a world where no one has to face their struggles alone, and where every voice, no matter how quiet, can help change the rules for the better. Subscribe, comment, and join the conversation. This is Auntie's Living Room, and you are always welcome here.